Thanks for coming. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how we track the eruptions here. And some of the other, it's a little different than some of the other talks because many of the other talks we discuss how the volcanoes work. But this really, in this talk, I'm going to be talking about what we do behind the scenes to monitor that activity. And I work very closely with Tim and Lil here, and they contributed to this. And there'll be pictures of them, of course. But here's the picture of Tim actually doing his job at the front of the lava flow as it was heading into Poho in late 2014. So if people might think that HVO geologists are out doing this all day, every day. And we are, of course, lucky to be able to do that sometimes. But the reality is a little less glamorous. It's a lot of work at the computer. The reality is we spend most of our time at our desks analyzing the data that we do collect in the field. Yeah, so not quite as glamorous. I mean, unless you really like ArcMap software. So yeah, there are a number of different groups at HVO, and there are folks that study seismic activity, the deformation of the volcano, and the gas geochemistry. And I'm part of the geology group. So really, the focus of this talk is not necessarily the broad HVO body of work, but it's mainly this group, the geology group, and we're in charge of making observations and measurements on the surface and mapping the flows and documenting the surface activity. And as many of you know, there's two ongoing eruptions on Kilauea. So Kilauea has the summit caldera, and it has two rift zones, a southwest rift zone and an east rift zone. The rift zones are just kind of zones of structural weakness that magma preferentially moves along and erupts from. And so there's a summit eruption that began in 2008. So we're approaching 10 years for that eruption, which is really remarkable. Even more remarkable is 34 years of activity at Poho. Just had its 34th birthday here. And it's produced this flow field, this lava flow field shown in red. Yeah, and again, the vent area is around Poho. So for this talk, I'm going to be talking about how we monitor these two eruptions, and I'm going to begin with the Poho eruption. But first, I want to say it's important to note that the two eruptions have very different eruption styles. Okay, so at the summit, most of you have seen the lava lake out there. And we have this lava lake that's within this crater, which we call the Overlook Crater. It's about 250 yards across, so it's big. It's actually one of the two largest lava lakes on Earth. And the magma is rising up into the lake, and it's circulating. It's coming to the surface, and it's circulating back down into the system. But on the East Rift Zone, of course, we have lava flows. So this is lava that erupts from the vent and spreads out onto the surface. Right now, most of that activity is Pohoihoi, like you see here. So two very different eruption styles, and so I'll be showing kind of different methods that we use to monitor the eruptions, but also you'll see some similarities in our approaches. Okay, so we have a summit eruption and the Poho eruption, and I'm going to be focusing on, or going to start with the Poho eruption. Okay, so how do we monitor those lava flows? Well, there are three main things that we do. And number one, we make basic observations, and we document those observations with photography. Number two, one of the most important things that we do is mapping. So establishing, measuring the extent of those flows. And of course, we also sample the lava. So I'm going to be going through each of these three things. So I'll begin with how we do our observations. Okay, so, well, first of all, we have to get out to the field to do those observations. And we're often asked, how often do we go out there? And the answer is it depends. It depends on basically how close the activity is to residential areas. So 2 years ago, when the flows were approaching Poho, we were down there, of course, every day, mapping the flow front, measuring the advance rate of that flow, to be able to provide, daily hazard assessments of the flow. But right now, the activity is much farther from residential areas. It's not really currently an imminent threat, so we go less often. We might go on overflights every couple weeks and go out into the field on foot a little more often. But to get out to the field, we have to figure out how to get out to the field. So if the flows are accessible, we can just hike out like we are here, and this is actually the flow just above Poho in late 2014. And also, if the flows are really close to the road, we can just drive out, park the car, and walk to the flow front. And this is what the case was again in Poho in late 2014. This is the flow coming down just a little bit west of the transfer station. And you can see some geologists here at the flow front. But whether we walk out or drive out, we're still on foot ultimately, and we can only access a small portion of that flow. And this flow going into Poho was, 15 miles long. So obviously it's very expansive, and when you're on foot, you can only, see a little bit of it, in a given day. So a much more efficient way to monitor the whole flow field, obviously, is to get up in the air in a helicopter. So we go on helicopter flights regularly. This is Tim getting ready to get in. Here he is. He's got one of the most important tools. He's got his camera ready to document what's going on. And so, so the helicopter obviously provides us, you could basically fly the length of the flow in a matter of minutes. So it's a really time-efficient way to see what's going on the whole flow field, all the way from the vent to the flow front. You couldn't do that really in a time-efficient manner if you were on foot. Obviously, also, it gives you a bird's-eye view of activity that you never get from the ground. So here's a channel that came out in May of last year. And, of course, it also allows you to see things from the air that you wouldn't necessarily be safe to approach on the ground. So this is this channel that came out in May of last year. It wouldn't necessarily be safe to walk up with all the shelly and slabby pohoihoi on the channel margins. But we get a clear view with the helicopter. So, the helicopter is a great tool for geologists. Okay, so and we get to have we get views that we couldn't otherwise get from the ground. Here's we get these wide, expansive views. We have the ocean entry here. This is taken on January 12th of this year, and you can see the entire flow field on the coastal plain here, the Pali, and all the way up to Pu'u'o. Okay, another tool that we use on our overflights, rather than just making visual observations and photography, is a thermal camera. And so the thermal camera, sees in the infrared, and it allows you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see with the naked eye. So here is a photo from our last overflight, January 12th, and you can see the upper flow field here. Actually, you can see all the way to the ocean entry here. You can get a sense of where the tube is based on these fuming sources, right? Like there. But it's kind of hard to see exactly where the tube is. So with the thermal camera in the same general area, you can see the path of the tube. And actually here it's pretty complicated. It's really interesting how, basically braided. Yeah, so, and again, you get to see things that you wouldn't see with the naked eye. So here's the ocean entry on January 12th. This is that chunk of the sea cliff that collapsed in on New Year's Eve, by the way. So the viewing area is right over here. Before New Year's, there was actually a large delta here, 26 acres, and that collapsed away. But here we can see, we can see a little bit of discoloration in the water. But with the thermal camera, you can see this hot water plume coming out from the entry. And actually, this surface temperature is, I think, it was 130 degrees Fahrenheit, so scalding temperature. Yeah, and one of the things that the thermal camera is really good at is identifying what areas of the flow field are active. So many of you, probably most of you, have hiked out to the Pohoihoi flow fields, on the coastal plain. Yeah, many of you have. So you've seen how the breakouts are often scattered, right? Just kind of randomly scattered on the surface, and there's small tubes supplying the lava beneath the surface. Obviously, for hazard assessment, we want to know where that activity is focused and where it's located. So with the naked eye, this is the flow in November of 2014 when it was basically in Poho. It's a little hard to see with the naked eye what portions of this flow are active and which parts are inactive. But with a thermal camera, the same view, you can see where that activity is focused. And particularly at this time, we were focused where we were concerned about this lobe that was active just upslope of the transfer station. But you can also see at this time, fortunately, the flow tip stalled about 150 yards from the village road. But it gives you a good idea of where the activity is focused on this very expansive flow field. Okay, so probably three of the most important tools that we use when we're out in the field are shown here. Obviously, we take direct visual observations just with our naked eye, but we want to document that and with photographs. And obviously, cameras these days can do really good video too. So if it's a really dynamic process, you can document it with video. GPS. Obviously, you want to know where the activity is located. So you can take very accurate geographic coordinates with your GPS. Do you know what else the GPS is really good at providing? Well, it can, but it's a really good timekeeper. Because the satellites have GPS satellites have atomic clocks, so it's kind of it's nice to know that sometimes your watch drifts, but it's nice to know that you have an accurate timepiece. And then documenting all your observations in your field notebook. So let's go through each of these three things here in the geologist toolkit. We're making visual observations. Here's Tim and Tamar at Poho looking in the crater. But obviously and you describe them in your field notebook, but it's obviously you want to document it. And photography is the best tool for that. Here's Lil taking a photograph of the flow when it was coming down the Poly in June of last year. Okay, our GPS, that's one of our most important tools, again, because we have to know exactly where the activity is. Tim is here just upslope of Poho taking a flow front, getting a flow front coordinate. And one of the ways that we track flow front progression is simply to take sequential waypoints, GPS points at the flow front, every hour or in successive days to track the progression of the flow. So actually, here's Tim in Poho in the field that's just next to the cemetery near the transfer station in October of 2014. And then, obviously, you have to record everything that you observe. So you have to record your measurements. You have to record the coordinates and basically write down your ideas of what you think is going on. Okay, so we're out in the field regularly, but we can't be out there all the time. So, and obviously if you work at a volcano observatory, you want continuous observations of the volcano. And so we rely on field webcams to provide 24/7 watch on the volcanoes. And so here are two cameras, a thermal camera and a visual camera looking in Poho Crater on the East Rift Zone. And they can capture things that we wouldn't necessarily be there to witness. So this is Poho Crater in March of 2011. It's a pretty big crater. It's 400 yards to the far wall there. And, okay, so yeah, the floor collapsed. It dropped about 80 yards. This happened at the time of an intrusion, basically, along the East Rift Zone that caused the magma chamber beneath Poho to drain away, and it basically just removed support from that crater floor and caused everything to drop. So that was March of 2011. Over the next few months in 2011, June, July, August, that crater that just drained there or collapsed refilled and it rebuilt a lava lake. And actually, here's a thermal camera sequence of that, the growth of that lava lake. So we're in June here, and you see that the lake is building up the levee from overflows, but then you'll see another process start to build the lake higher. Yeah, you see this kind of what's called endogenous, the uplift, basically from the just kind of internal uplift. Oh, and then you saw it drop, right? Yeah, basically, well, I'll show you that drop in this other video. So we happen to have another camera on the rim. This is, again, August of 2011. This is the lava lake, obviously sped up, and then, yeah, it drained. So we had another intrusion in August that basically caused the magma chamber at Poho to drain away, and it removed support from the lava lake and the crater floor and basically just pulled the plug. So things like this happen. Well, you can see the benefit of these continuous images shown in time-lapse sequence, because you can speed up processes and see them on a reasonable time scale. Okay, so I talked about observations and photography. Now let's look at mapping. How do we do our mapping? This is one of the most important things that we do. Okay, this is the most recent published map on the HVO webpage. And you see a bunch of things here. You see Poho Crater here. Here's the flow field in gray. And the pink area is the episode 61G flow, the current flow. The vent is here. And the yellow line is lava tube supplying lava to the ocean. And then we have in dark red, basically, well, the pink is the flow as it was mapped on December 14th. The dark red here is showing the expansion of that flow between December 14th and January 12th. And then we have these blue lines. And the blue lines are just basically lines of slope or drainages. And they give us a rough sense of where the lava could go. So it's pretty complicated, huh? But surprisingly, it's actually very simple to make a map. So it's really just a three-step process. So, I might go out there and collect some GPS waypoints. And then step 2 is I hand the GPS to Tim. And then magically, a few hours later, a map is produced. So you really just have to find Tim if you want to map it. So, okay, well, maybe it's a little more complicated than that. So let's look at what Tim does to make these maps. Okay, and he uses GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, which is just a fancy name for mapping software. And here he is with the software open looking at the most recent flow field map. Okay, so let's look at what he does. Here's a screenshot of that GIS software. And these are all different layers. So GIS software is all about layers. So we might have a base map layer here, which is this satellite image. And then this pink area is that polygon showing the lava flow field, or the episode 61G flow as of when it was mapped on December 14th. So, yeah, and then we have a layer here showing the park boundary, for instance. Okay, so, I'll go back. So we flew out on January 12th. We circled Poho, looked around, and we could see, just with the naked eye, that there was some new activity over here. And it looked like it had expanded the margin here. So we're like, okay, we have to update the flow map here. So we landed, and Lil hopped out and basically started mapping, walking along this margin with a GPS, handheld GPS. The GPS was collecting a waypoint every 2 seconds. He just walked along the margin, just like this. So this is actually a picture of Tim, but it's the same area. You get the point. This is the flow margin, walking along it with a GPS. And when she was done, a few hours later, she produced this line. So this is a track log of her GPS. She walked along the margin, so it's showing the updated flow margin. And you can see that, okay, so it's obviously expanded this margin here this much. So this is all new lava on the surface. So we have to update this polygon. So let's look close. Each of those little points is a 2-second interval of Lil walking along the margin. You can see all of this basically was new expansion of the flow. So go back to that wider view. So here we have our GPS track log. And so we're going to use these points to basically update this pink polygon. We're showing that in red. So the red is again, we have a new layer here, is the January 12th polygon. It's actually underneath the December 14th polygon, so we can show the changes. So that's one way, a common way that we update our flow field map. So you can see that it can be kind of time consuming. And actually, so that's just looking at that area. And this is the entire flow length. And actually, we've mapped on foot this whole margin and back, and actually several times. So but there's actually, so obviously you can imagine walking the margin. It's a very accurate way to map the margin, but there are quicker ways to do it. So one of the ways we do it is with a thermal camera. And yeah, so here's the thermal camera again. Let me see. Yeah, so we came out on January 12th. We flew around this lobe here because we knew it was new. We flew around it with a thermal camera and collected a sequence of thermal images like this. So this is actually what we collected on January 12th. So you can see this lobe. Actually, the tip of this lobe is cooled, but you can see these scattered breakouts on this new flow. So we collected a whole bunch of overlapping oblique thermal images. So we take those images, I don't know, there were maybe 100 or 200 of them. We bring it into this software, and this software is called Structure from Motion software. And it's really clever software that basically, if you take a series of overlapping oblique images, you put it into the software is smart enough that it can kind of figure out where each pixel is supposed to be in 3D space. So we can use all of those overlapping thermal images and basically make a mosaic of the thermal images and basically make a thermal map, which is pretty cool. And then I put in these ground control points based on other maps, and that basically locks that map, that thermal map, to the ground. So otherwise, it's kind of just floating in space. So yeah, we've just created a thermal map of that new flow. So it's a new layer in our GIS software. Brought that in. Here's the layer. Okay, so compare it to our December 14th map, shown in outline, shown in yellow here. We'll zoom in here. So here's that new flow. You can see, obviously, it's warm. And obviously, it's off of our December 14th margin, so it's expanded that margin. So then we can just outline the new activity, based on the thermal map, and update our flow polygon. Okay, so maybe that was more than you wanted to know about GIS software, but anyway, it can be time-consuming. I guess that's the take-home point. So this method of thermal mapping is actually pretty cool. We've just been using it over there, kind of developing it over the last couple of years. And this is a good example of why it's so useful is 2 years ago when the activity was active, or it was active, the flow was active upslope of the Poho marketplace. So this is the flow front here, or the flow front area. And at that time, this flow was active just, several hundred yards upslope of Poho marketplace. So obviously, this was a big hazard concern. But thankfully, the thermal map here showing black values here, basically cold pixels, are showing this finger here is inactive. So that was obviously good news for the marketplace. But look at this lobe here. You can see all of these basically hot pixels. A very active lobe of lava that's active just upslope of the fire and police station. So thankfully, this flow front stalled. It was stalling around this time. So it didn't cross the road or ultimately threaten these areas. But anyway, these thermal maps are basically a way that we can map out where that Poho activity is focused. Okay, so we have another thing here in the map. We have this yellow line, which is the lava tube. And I showed you an image of how we can see the lava tubes in the thermal images. And so we can use that same approach, that structure for motion software, and we can basically fly around the tube and collect a series of oblique overlapping thermal images, bring them into the software, and create a thermal map of the tube. And so this is you can see how complicated it is and how it's braided. And these are really cool views, because we haven't necessarily had views like this of such detailed views of where the lava tube is. Okay, so we go out regularly, but we also kind of fill in the gaps between our field visits with satellite images. So this is a NASA EO1 satellite image showing the flow field here. And here's the vent. This is when the flow was moving down the poly and across the coastal plain. There's some NASA folks in the audience, so they'll appreciate this. So we talked about observations and mapping, and now let's look at how we do our sampling. So here's Tim. He's collecting a sample here of this Poho lobe. And he's just using a rock hammer, standard rock hammer, dipping it in the fluid lobe. Obviously, it's hot, so you want to wear special gloves. And he's wearing a face mask, obviously, to protect his face. And what he's going to do is he's going to drop that into this bucket of water. And the reason he does that is he wants to quench the lava. Basically, he wants to freeze the lava in its pristine state, in the state that it was when it was inside the flow. What you don't want to happen is you don't want to just set the lava to the side and let it cool slowly, because then it crystallizes and it kind of changes its makeup. So we want to freeze it. And here, I'll show you the sequence here. Here's Tim. This is with a helmet cam. And he's filling the bucket. We used to use coffee cans, but they often just got rusted through. So you have to find an active breakout. And you don't want something that's too active, because then it's just really hot. But you want to find something that's a little bit active, and just active enough that you can, that's fluid. So it looks like he's found one here. OK, so you have to take the skin off, and then you have the fluid lava inside. Yeah, so somebody said yeah, so actually sometimes the viscosity is very different. Like near the vent where it's really gassy, it's almost like marshmallow fluff, like really frothy. But then closer to the, farther away from the vent has less gas, and it's more of like a molasses. Okay, so then he has to get away from the flow to tend to the sample. Okay, so then we bag up the sample. You have to put the coordinates, date, time, description of the sample into our sample bag, and then we send that to the geology department at Hilo and to colleagues on the mainland who then analyze the chemical composition. So one of the things that we've learned from looking at the chemistry of the lava, we've looked at the chemistry at Halemaumau and at Poho on the East Rift Zone, and they're basically very similar. They're essentially the same magmas. So what that's reinforcing is how the lava from each of those eruptions has a common source. So they're jointly supplied by the summit reservoir, the summit magma chamber. Yeah, so basically that chemistry can tell us about the magmatic plumbing system. Okay, so I talked about the Poho eruption. Now let's look at the summit eruption.